Hi, everyone. Today we'll be giving a brief overview of the fallacy known as post hoc ergo propter hoc. Translated into English, roughly speaking, it would mean after this, therefore because of this. So post hoc, after this, ergo, therefore, propter hoc, because of this. I think the reason that it's kept its Latin name is that there's not an easy, snappy English term that will capture the idea. So it's kept in the Latin. Sometimes it's abbreviated to just a post hoc fallacy. And once you think about the English translation, as clunky as it is, you get an idea of what the mistake in reasoning is. So this fallacy occurs when someone makes the inference that one thing caused another simply because they're closely associated in time, closely correlated in time. So for example, event A happens, then event B. You might assume that, well, event A must have caused event B simply because B happened right after A happened. That's a mistake because there's not necessarily any connection between the two. There's not necessarily at least any cause and effect relation between the two. It could just be a coincidence. The two things might be completely unrelated. Of course, it might be that A caused B, but to have a decent argument for that, we would need more evidence. We couldn't simply point to the fact that B happened shortly after A, because, as we said, that might be a coincidence, it might be unrelated. To provide a good inductive argument, you would want to provide more evidence, right? So you'd want to isolate the events maybe and show that you can reproduce them, that yes, not just this one time B happened after A, but every time we run an experiment, for example. That would be a common approach in all sorts of scientific experiments. So as I said, the post hoc fallacy is an inductive fallacy. So if you're investigating empirical phenomena, right, so you're doing a chemistry experiment or something like that, you definitely want to avoid this mistake. And of course, any trained chemist would. Whether or not they use the term post hoc to identify the mistake, they certainly would acknowledge it's a mistake to simply take two events closely related in time and assume that they're causally connected. So I'll give an example of the post hoc fallacy. There's a story of a philosophy professor back in the old days, I mean, not that long ago, but some decades ago, who was giving a lecture about God and looking at arguments for the existence of God, which have been a classic in philosophy. And at some point, the professor, who was an atheist, said, well, clearly, God does not exist. There's no such thing as a God. And at that very moment, there was a stroke of thunder outside the classroom. And of course, half jokingly, the students thought, well, clearly, your impious pronouncement that there is no God is what caused the thunder to occur, right? It's a sign from God showing you, hey, I do exist, and you're being a bit arrogant by presuming that I don't. Now, that was meant as a joke, presumably, that the students didn't really think the two things were causally connected. But if they had, they would be committing the post hoc fallacy. They would be saying that, well, the professor said something, and then a second later, we heard this thunder. Therefore, we reason, we infer that the professor's remark must have caused the thunder. The thunder is an effect of what the professor said. That would be too hasty, right? As we've said, it could just be a coincidence, and in this case, I presume it was. I guess it's possible there's a causal connection, but simply pointing to the fact that there was a short period of time between the two does not establish a cause and effect relationship. We need a lot more evidence to feel confident about that. So the post hoc fallacy, it occurs in all sorts of settings. Sometimes people do, to stick with the religious omens example, sometimes people do take one-off events like that as a sign from God, right? Something strange happens, right? Somebody, there's some odd event, and people interpret that as, oh, it must have been some kind of divine intervention. So it's not just a joke. People really do sort of buy that reasoning in some cases. You want to make sure you avoid it, though. The mistake is one of jumping to a conclusion that it just isn't justified by the evidence. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and that's just a very brief overview of post hoc ergo propter hoc.